When people think about politics in Arizona, they usually think of it as a Republican powerhouse that has recently become a purple state. But this simply isn't the case. Yes, some big hitters like Barry Goldwater and John McCain impacted national elections, with some of those being seismic, like Goldwater's performance in the 1964 presidential election. But Arizona has a history of being a state that goes back and forth between Democrats and Republicans throughout its time as a U.S. state. In fact, 9 elections for governor have been decided by less than 2%, with Democrats mostly dominating politics in Arizona until the mid 1960s, which saw a similar trend to other Western states, as was noticed in the last video in this series about Alaska. In fact, the Democrats were so dominant that they held every single seat in the state Senate from 1937 to 1952 and every seat in the state House between 1941 and 1945. But from 1967 until now, the Republicans have been in control of the state House, with the state Senate mostly being in control by the Republicans. In this video, we're going to look at the political history of Arizona since statehood. Hello, my name is Dave, and welcome to Election History. I received my master's degree in political science from McGill University and make videos about campaigns, elections, political parties, candidates, and the likes. If this is something that you like, please subscribe to the channel and hit the like button down below. If you would like to help out the channel more, you can become a member of my Patreon, where you can get extra content and participate in polls about upcoming videos. This video about Arizona is part of a series which briefly looks at the electoral history of every state in the United States. Yes, some of these videos might be long, but they are still a brief history nonetheless, as I don't get into every little esoteric detail of each state. This is the 4th video of the series, which includes Alabama, Alaska, and Utah. California and Arkansas will be the next based on the most recent Patreon poll. In the description, you will find a playlist of these videos if you would like to binge watch them, and with that, let's delve into Arizona. According to political scientist Frank Jonas, Arizona was a state that was liberal, progressive, and radical when it achieved statehood in 1912. Between the Civil War and becoming a state, many who came to the state were looking for riches in mining, which was a little late to the mining rushes of California and other western states. The reason for this was that Arizona was arid and lacked one of the most important resources to survive, which was water. But as the settlers started to figure out how to restore the ancient Hohokam irrigation system, which was built in the pre-Columbian era, populations started to pop up along the canal system, such as in Phoenix. But prior to restoring the system, there were a number of pioneers who came before the Civil War, with a number of Mormons settling in eastern Arizona. And of course, there were the Native American and Mexican American populations that had settled the land prior to the 1860s. Further expansion of the freshwater system, such as the construction of the Roosevelt Dam in 1911, made Arizona more attractive to copper mining companies. Even today, copper accounts for about 65% of all copper extracted from the United States. And with these mining companies coming to Arizona, unions, progressive, and socialist values were strong in the early days of statehood. Prior to statehood, governors to the state were appointed by the president, which means that Republican politicians dominated the post-Civil War period, with the exception of when Andrew Johnson and Grover Cleveland were president. Still, the first election in Arizona was just prior to statehood to figure out how the state government would look, which meant that the first elections for state and federal government were held on December 12, 1911. As I mentioned before, progressive and socialist values were common, which meant that in these early elections there were likely either socialist or progressive candidates. That was no different in 1911 when P.W. Galantine ran as the socialist candidate for governor. He would take on Republican Edmund Wells, who had been a territorial Supreme Court justice in Arizona, and George Hunt, the Democratic candidate who served in the territorial state legislature. Hunt was a true progressive Democrat, supporting many of the initiatives that would eventually be supported by Woodrow Wilson's New Freedom policy a year later when he ran for president. If you want to know more about the progressive politics at the time, you can check out this video here. Anyway, the socialists weren't a political threat, but could tip the balance one way or the other. If neither of the candidates talked about workers' issues, unionized workers could vote for the socialists, which would then hurt the Democrats, who were quickly becoming the party of organized labor. As for the Republicans, much of their support came from the Northerners who had migrated to Arizona but still kept their pro Union Republican political leanings. Luckily for the Democrats, Hunt was a strongly pro organized Union candidate and pulled off the win. All of the constitutional offices were also won by the Democrats, and both the state House and state Senate had supermajorities for the Democrats. Democrats would dominate yet again in 1914, and just so you know, the terms for governor were only 2 years at this point. In the federal elections, the Democrats would win all three offices, which were the two U.S. Senate seats and the representative in Congress. All three of these would stay in Congress until 1920. First, let's start with the member that would stay in Washington the shortest amount of time, which is Senator Marcus Aurelius Smith. Smith was a lawyer born in Kentucky but practiced in San Francisco and eventually Tombstone. He would be Arizona's delegate to Congress before being elected to the U.S. Senate. He easily won in 1912 by 6.5% and for the full term in 1914 by 35.1%. In the early days of the Democratic Party in Arizona, many of the party factions were driven by personal loyalties, such as there were in Alaska during their early years of statehood. Usually, Smith was the figure that was able to bring these factions together, but then using the feuding factions to support his political ambitions. He also shifted his political stance from being a conservative to calling himself a progressive. Again, because Arizona's labor movement could be pivotal in close elections, it was better to have them on your side than against you, as I mentioned in the gubernatorial election. During his time in the U.S. Senate, he continued to support Wilson's New Freedom legislation, but also supported environmental legislation as well as opposing American expansionism, such as the annexation of Hawaii and making the Philippines an American colony. When it came to his re-election in 1920, some argued that Smith had become more moderate on labor issues. But the reality is that the labor movement itself was becoming more radical, and Smith continued to support the positions of the Democratic Party, which weren't far from what he had supported in the past. This, combined with support for Wilson's League of Nations and other personal issues, led to his defeat to Ralph Cameron in 1920, who would in turn lose to Carl Hayden, who was the congressman from Arizona at the time. We'll come back to Hayden, as he is the third longest serving member of Congress behind Robert Byrd and John Dingell. The other senator from Arizona was Henry F. Ashurst, who would serve from 1912 until 1940. Unlike Smith, who is very much an establishment politician, Ashurst was very much a populist, being compared to the likes of Huey Long in Louisiana and being considered one of the great orators at the time. But unlike Smith, who had been involved with Washington politics for years, Ashurst was a creature of state politics, becoming the youngest Speaker of the Arizona Territory's House of Representatives and influential in the Constitutional Convention of 1911. During his time in the U.S. Senate, he was erratic to say the least. He would always say that he supported or opposed something, but then would go ahead and did the opposite. For example, when President Franklin Roosevelt sought to pack the U.S. Supreme Court, Ashurst was strongly against it, but then would eventually support it. He constantly said one thing and did the other, making him known as the Dean of Inconsistency, a title that he gave himself. Therefore, his voting record was all over the place and almost impossible to describe. Still, the voters of Arizona liked him because of his personality and oratory skills. He even ended his Senate career with a contradiction. In his final speech to the U.S. Senate, he said that he would move back to Arizona, but he never moved back, stayed in Washington, and died there in 1962. This brings us to the man who was elected to Congress and eventually the U.S. Senate, Carl Hayden. Hayden is the third longest serving member of Congress, serving 56 years and 319 days. Like Marcus Smith, Hayden found his way into the Bay Area, attending Stanford before having to drop out because of his father's illness and eventual death. After returning from Stanford, he got involved with Democratic Party politics in Maricopa County. He was first elected the county's treasurer and then later sheriff between 1907 and 1912 when he was elected to Congress. Being sheriff of the largest county in Arizona gave Hayden name recognition, but so did his job performance. During his time as sheriff, the West in general was going through a transformation from being the Wild West frontier to being a settlement for families. He did this by imposing a number of taxes and regulations with strict enforcement, which led to most illegal operations being driven underground or leaving Maricopa County entirely. Unlike Smith and Ashurst, Hayden wasn't involved with the process of helping Arizona gain statehood. But with statehood being achieved, Hayden decided to run for Arizona's at large congressional seat. His two primary opponents were highly involved with state politics and well known. One opponent was Milford Windsor, a strong progressive and newspaper owner who was a member of the territorial legislature and involved with the statehood process. The other opponent was Lamar Cobb, who was also a member of the territorial legislature and known for creating the state's young infrastructure projects. However, even though the other two men had more experience when it came to legislating, they were also from smaller counties, with Windsor from Yuma County and Cobb from tiny Graham County. Hayden's Maricopa County experienced heavy turnout, with Hayden receiving 75% of the vote in that county. But even in Graham County, which was where Cobb was from, Hayden won most of the votes. He would win the October 24th primary with 44.2% of the vote. He would dominate the general election, winning by 14.4%. The election to the full term was held the next year in 1912. Hayden would be unopposed in the Democratic primary and easily win the general election. Interestingly, it was the progressive candidate, Robert S. Fisher, who would finish second. Remember, this was a year that Teddy Roosevelt ran as a Bull Moose candidate, which finished second in the state. Therefore, progressive candidates did well in Arizona. However, the presidential candidate that finished third was socialist Eugene Debs, with Arizona being his fourth best state. This affected the congressional race as well, with socialist candidate A. Charles Smith winning 12.9% of the vote, only 74 votes behind Republican candidate Thomas Edward Campbell, someone that we'll talk about soon. After 1912, Hayden didn't have any serious competition when it came to the House, with his closest election being a 15.6% margin. In his last election for the House, Hayden won 82.3% of the vote. With that, he jumped into the U.S. Senate race in 1926 against Ralph Cameron, who defeated Marcus Smith 6 years earlier. During his time in the U.S. Senate, Cameron, who supported unpopular pro-tariff legislation, as well as having a number of personal and legal issues, which are too esoteric to talk about in this video, was a vulnerable candidate. But interestingly, many of the accomplishments that Cameron had achieved in regards to federal funding for Arizona were in a shared spotlight with Carl Hayden. Therefore, Cameron's strengths were also Hayden's strengths. Hayden would win the U.S. Senate seat by 16.7%. During his time in the U.S. Senate, Hayden would mostly be known as a strong supporter of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, as well as bringing a lot of public works projects to Arizona. He would also serve as the chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee from 1955 to 1969, making him easily one of the most powerful senators during this time. However, he wasn't necessarily a high-profile senator, as he was more concerned about bringing funds to Arizona than he was about any higher ambition, such as running for president. He decided not to run for re-election in 1968, with his seat being won by former U.S. Senator Barry Goldwater, who we'll come back to later. Now, before we jump too far ahead, we need to come back to the early days of statehood and to the gubernatorial elections. Let's pick up where we left off, which was George Hunt winning his second term as governor in 1914. As mining and other businesses started picking up in the state, more businesses and those in the managerial class also started flocking to Arizona. This started to make the state a bit more conservative. In the 1916 election, Hunt, who was backed by labor and progressives, ran against Thomas Edward Campbell, who was the state tax collector and backed by business interests in Arizona, who opposed Hunt further supporting regulations on businesses. When all the votes were counted, Campbell won by 30 votes. Hunt refused to leave, saying that he was the true winner. But once the Secretary of State certified the results, Campbell was sworn in as the state's governor. Hunt then challenged Campbell's results in court, claiming that there was improper vote counting and other voting irregularities. The state Supreme Court reviewed disputed and rejected ballots, as well as supposed errors in recounting the ballots. After the court-mandated recount, the court concluded that Hunt had actually won by around 45 votes. Campbell would serve from New Year's Day until Christmas Day of 1917, with Hunt serving out the rest of this term. But the stress of the court battle resulted in Hunt not seeking re election. The 1918 Democratic primary was mostly a conservative versus progressive contest, with Fred Coulter, who was the most progressive in the field, winning the nomination. The Republican nominee was again Thomas Campbell. A third candidate, socialist George Smith, also ran, but the socialists weren't as strong as they were 4 years previously. But this was to be yet another close election for Campbell. When election night came, Coulter had a slight lead as most of the smaller counties supported Coulter. But as Maricopa County started counting, which took a few days, Campbell then took the lead. In the end, Campbell won by 339 votes, with 444 votes going to socialist George Smith. Of course, it's pure speculation, but many assume that if there were no socialist candidates, then Coulter would have pulled off the very slim victory. Regardless, unlike Hunt, Coulter didn't drag the elections into court and Campbell became governor. In 1920, Campbell ran for re-election and won by 8.3%, also bringing in a number of Republicans at the state level. This was probably a result of the popularity of the Democratic Party declining. Remember, Arizona was a strong Union state. And with the first Red Scare in 1919 and 1920, many in Arizona didn't trust the Democratic Party. The Democratic nominee for governor, Mitt Sims, didn't have a strong labor background. Essentially, the Democrats were the enemy of many in labor, with the election essentially becoming an enemy of my enemy is my friend election. But in 1922, fully recovered from his stress, as well as serving as U.S. Minister to Siam, which is now Thailand, George Hunt returned to Arizona to run for governor. Unlike Sims, Hunt had the credentials when it came to backing labor. Hunt would win the 1922 election by nearly 10%. One of Hunt's staunchest opponents was the Arizona Republican newspaper, which is known as the Arizona Republic today. The owner of the paper in 1924 was Dwight Hurd, a partisan Republican but also a progressive, supporting Teddy Roosevelt when he ran against President Taft at the 1912 Republican Convention, something that I talk about in detail in this video here. Hurd would be the Republican nominee, with Hunt getting the Democratic nod. The problem for Hunt was not just that Hurd was a progressive Republican, but also a newspaper owner, thus had the ability to win over labor and business interests. As for Hunt, he had his record of supporting labor to run on. In the end, it was another very close election for governor, with Hunt winning by only 1.1%. Again, this election wasn't contested, and Hunt would serve his fifth term as governor. In 1926, Hunt would win another close election, with Hunt running against Republican challenger Elias Clark, who had been Attorney General during territorial times. While many voters thought that Hunt was too old, now in his late 60s, another issue was in regards to water rights throughout the state. At this time, the Colorado River Compact sought to distribute water throughout the Colorado River Basin, dividing it up into upper and lower basins. Arizona was in the lower basin, along with California and Nevada. Hunt opposed the compact, saying that it took away state sovereignty and that, in the end, water resources would not be divided properly. The Republicans argued that the compact was more important for economic development for the state. On election day, Hunt led Clark by 360 votes, but by the next day, Clark took the lead by 22 votes. But eventually, Hunt barely won yet again, winning by only 399 votes, or 0.5%. Looking at the newspaper accounts at the time, it doesn't seem as if Clark contested the results. As with the last two presidential elections, the 1928 election would impact state government results in Arizona. But voters were getting tired of Hunt, as his age had now advanced. Even though the state had achieved statehood 16 years earlier, the state had only two governors, with Hunt as governor for 11 of those years. With Herbert Hoover winning the presidential contest in Arizona by over 15%, the voters of Arizona kicked Hunt out of office in favor of John Calhoun Phillips. But it wasn't just an age thing. Phillips campaigned on business development and lower taxes. Also, the labor interests, while still strong, were not as strong as they were in the early days of statehood. Hunt continued to support large infrastructure projects and government spending, but with Hoover's fiscal conservatism, Phillips prevailed. Then came the Great Depression, with Hunt coming back to run yet again for governor in 1930. He was challenged in the Democratic primary, but only won with 48.4% of the votes. In the general election, Hunt won by 2.78% over Phillips. Hunt's victory could probably be credited to the Democratic sweep nationwide, with the Democrats gaining 8 seats in the U.S. Senate and 52 seats in the House of Representatives. But in 1932, he was challenged by 5 Democrats for the nomination. However, this time, Democratic voters went with Tempe School Board member Benjamin Baker Mower, who defeated Hunt by over 6% in the primary. With the Democratic sweep in 1932, Mower easily won the election with 63.2% of the votes. Mower would continue most of the same policies as Hunt, with Hunt running again for the Democratic nomination in 1934. This time, he finished third behind Mower and Rogile Clement Stanford, with Mower winning a second term. In 1936, Stanford would easily defeat Mower in the Democratic primary, as Stanford was seen as more supportive of Roosevelt's New Deal, while Mower was more conservative. In the general election, Stanford defeated former Governor Thomas Edward Campbell by over 40%. Even though many think of Arizona as a state with a conservative history, it was probably one of the most pro-New Deal states during Roosevelt's terms. In the 1940 Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate, Ernest McFarland defeated incumbent Senator Henry Ashurst by over 22%. With Ashurst never reliable on the issues and McFarland a strong New Dealer, voters went with the policy over personality. McFarland would stay in the Senate until 1953, when he was defeated by Barry Goldwater in the 1956 election. Now, I'm not really going to talk about Arizona during Roosevelt's time as president because the Democratic Party dominated state politics. Between 1932 and 1944, Mower's 1932 victory of 21.5% was the worst of any Democrat, with many in the 70% range. The worst performance in the U.S. Senate was also in 1932, with Carl Hayden only winning 66.7% of the vote. Democrats also dominated the U.S. House races. Interestingly, when Arizona gained a congressional seat in 1942, all candidates ran on a general election ticket for an at-large district, with the top 2 vote-getters going to Congress. Democrats dominated both and continued to dominate when the state went to single-member districts in 1948. And when it came to state government, Arizona had a unified government. No, I mean a real unified government. For example, in 1941, not only did the Democrats hold the governorship and all the state constitutional offices, as well as all federal positions, but they held every legislative seat. And note, that's not an exaggeration. They literally held every seat in the state House and state Senate, making it a truly unified government. And no, there were no third parties or independents, they were all Democrats. Even after Roosevelt died, Arizona remained strongly Democratic over the next few years, continuing to strongly support the New Deal. With that, we arrive at 1950. First of all, Carl Hayden was reelected as senator, mostly because of personal popularity and the weight that he pulled in the U.S. Senate. The same held true for John R. Murdoch and Harold Patton, the 2 congressmen from the state. But in state politics, things started to shift. After World War II, a large number of people moved to the state, particularly those who identified as Republicans. On top of that, the current governor, Dan Garvey, assumed the position after the death of Governor Sidney Preston Osborne. Garvey would lose the Democratic primary to Ann Frohmiller. The 1950 Democratic Party primary was mostly a factional battle within the party, with many Democrats refusing to support Frohmiller's candidacy simply because of personal differences. And while it did get her close, Republican John Howard Pyle would win the election by less than 3,000 votes, or 1.5%. According to Ross Rice, much of this population growth was due to former servicemen moving to the area, as well as those retiring from northern states. While most of the post-World War II migration from the east, such as New York and New Jersey, went to Florida, much of the Midwest, such as residents from Illinois, found their way to Arizona. With this change, the strength of labor in the state decreased as retirees, who were the fastest growing population, didn't have to worry about work, wages, or workers' rights and safety. And, as I mentioned, many of these voters were conservative, being part of the managerial class during their working days up north. Therefore, the new Arizonan was naturally more conservative. It should also be noted that most of these new voters moved to Maricopa County and would have a strong influence in elections there for decades to come. The same year that Pyle won re election, Senator Ernest McFarland was being challenged by Phoenix Council member and department store owner Barry Goldwater. In this campaign, McFarland was campaigning as a pre war Democrat, strongly tied to the unions and the New Deal, with Goldwater campaigning as a post war Republican, focused on limited government, reduced spending, and being business friendly. With the shift in the electorate and Maricopa County now becoming a conservative hub, Goldwater defeated McFarland by 2.6%, and the only Republican to win a U.S. Senate race in Arizona since Ralph Cameron defeated Marcus Smith in 1920. In the same year that Goldwater was elected, which was also a wave year for Republicans with Dwight Eisenhower leading the Republican ticket, John Rhodes was elected to Congress for his first term. Rhodes would go on to become the Republican House Minority Leader in 1973. Interestingly, it was Rhodes and Goldwater who approached Richard Nixon during the Watergate scandal and told him that he would be impeached and removed, sealing the fate for Richard Nixon's presidency. The 1954 election was stronger for Democrats. Now out of the U.S. Senate and no longer connected to Harry Truman, who was now deeply unpopular within the newly conservative state, Ernest McFarland ran against John Howard Pyle for governor, winning by 5%. In Congress that year, Rhodes would win the 1st congressional district, with the 2nd being held by the Democrats, now being represented by Stuart Udall. The 1956 election didn't see any change, with the exception of McFarland winning by a much larger margin than 2 years prior, now winning by 19%. But for McFarland, he thought that he could win his old U.S. Senate seat back and decided to take on Barry Goldwater. For McFarland, the economy wasn't strong and the Republicans were starting to have some troubles, and 1958 was shaping up to be a massive Democratic wave year. But a few things were going against McFarland. First of all, he went back to campaigning on federal issues such as the New Deal, which was becoming more unpopular in Arizona. Remember, many of the retirees that came to Arizona were well off and didn't really rely on Social Security to make ends meet. Another problem was that Goldwater himself had been building a national profile as a leading conservative in Washington, with most of the Republican Party still being considered moderate at the time. It's fair to say that Goldwater didn't exactly fit the national Republican mold, but he was a perfect fit for the increasingly conservative Arizona. Goldwater would beat McFarland by 12.1%. In the governor's race, the position that McFarland vacated in order to run for the U.S. Senate, Paul Fannin, a businessman who owned a gas and oil supply company, defeated Democratic Attorney General Robert Morrison by 10.3%. The 1960 election didn't see any changes, with Fannin easily winning re-election as governor. However, a few months later, Stuart Udall was appointed as John F. Kennedy's Secretary of the Interior, leading to a special election in 1961 in which Mo Udall, Stuart's brother, was elected. In 1962, Fannin won yet again, with Hayden winning the Senate seat by only 9.9%. I say only because this was his worst electoral performance. With the state naturally becoming more conservative, Republican Evan Meacham won 45% of the votes. We'll get back to him later. As for the congressional seats, Arizona gained another seat, with Democrat George Center easily winning. Now we've come to 1964, and Barry Goldwater decided not to run for the U.S. Senate seat and instead run for president. With that being said, this is a video about the electoral history of Arizona, not the presidential election of 1964. Suffice to say, Goldwater won the state of Arizona, but only by 1% over Lyndon Johnson. Governor Fannin decided to run for Goldwater's Senate seat, beating Carl Hayden's political aide, Roy Elson, by 2.9%. Samuel Goddard, who lost to Fannin in the 1962 race for governor, was elected governor this time with 53.2% of the votes. All three incumbent congressmen won re election. Even though Goldwater was the Republican nominee in 1964, the elections in Arizona were pretty unremarkable. While 1964 wasn't anything special, 1966 was the start of Republican dominance in the state. At the federal level, there were no Senate races, but two-term Democratic Congressman George Center lost to Republican State Senator Sam Steiger, giving the Republicans control of the Arizona delegation for the first time since statehood. But it was at the state level that saw the biggest changes. First, incumbent governor Sam Goddard was defeated by Phoenix Mayor Jack Williams by 7.5%. Second, both the state House and the state Senate flipped over to the Republicans. The last time the Republicans had control of the state Senate was in 1922, while they had never been in control of the state House. However, since 1966, the Republicans have retained control of the state House. Only popular Secretary of State Wesley Bolin won for the Democrats. Now, there are a number of reasons for this shift. As we have been talking about, Arizona was becoming steadily more Republican, and more Republicans from elsewhere moved into the state. This was becoming increasingly apparent with each and every year. But the Great Society was very unpopular in Arizona. I've talked about the Great Society in detail in other videos regarding the racial component, and while there might have been some of that in Arizona, the state was probably the most fiscally conservative state in the nation. Therefore, it would make sense that most voters in Arizona opposed government assistance. 2 years later, in 1968, the Republican domination in Arizona continued. This time, Barry Goldwater ran for U.S. Senate again to replace the retiring Carl Hayden. Hayden's right-hand man, Roy Elson, yet ran again but lost to Goldwater by 14.4%. Also in 1968, voters approved a change to the state's constitution to change the term of governor from 2 to 4 years. Jack Williams won re-election in 1968 and then again in 1970, which would be the first 4-year term. But the 1970 election for Williams wasn't easy. His opponent was Raul Hector Castro, the former ambassador to Bolivia and El Salvador under Lyndon Johnson. Castro announced his candidacy on June 18, 1970, to a group of about 50 people at the Tucson Press Club. However, if you were to read Wikipedia, it says that nobody showed up to his announcement. Again, you can't trust everything on Wikipedia. Still, he was considered a long shot since he was from Pima County, where Tucson is located. Conventional wisdom was that only a candidate from Maricopa County could win a statewide election. But with the help of organized labor in Maricopa County, Castro pulled off a huge upset, winning 52% of the primary vote. The general election was close, with incumbent Jack Williams winning by only 1.8%. According to the Arizona Republic, Castro had a weaker than expected turnout in rural counties, which allowed Williams to pull ahead by winning Maricopa County. In 1972, not much happened with the exception of Arizona gaining a 4th congressional district, which the Republicans won. But in 1974, the year of Watergate, not even Arizona was spared the backlash. The two bright spots for the Republicans were that Barry Goldwater easily won re-election to the U.S. Senate, and House Republicans, now led by John Rhodes, held onto their 3 seats. However, in the governor's race, Raul Hector Castro ran again and won by 0.9%. Democrats also won the constitutional offices with the exception of treasurer, with Bruce Babbitt being elected as the state's attorney general. The state Senate would also flip to the Democrats. 1976 had 2 positive results for the Democrats. First, in the U.S. Senate race, Paul Fannin retired from the Senate, with Democratic attorney Dennis DeConcini defeating Republican Congressman Sam Steiger. Steiger's congressional seat would be lost to Bob Stump, with that seat eventually flipping to the Republicans in 1982 after Stump switched parties. Just 2 years into his term as governor, Castro resigned to take the ambassadorship to Argentina, being replaced by Wesley Bolin, who had been Secretary of State since 1949. But Bolin didn't last in that position for long, as he died while in office in March of 1978, leading to Bruce Babbitt becoming governor. Babbitt would beat Republican Evan Meacham by 7.7%. 1980 was an interesting year for Republicans. First, they retook control of the state Senate, and at the presidential level, Ronald Reagan dominated, winning the state with 60.6% of the vote. However, the same couldn't be said for the man that put Reagan in the national spotlight 16 years earlier, Barry Goldwater. When returns started coming in, Goldwater looked as if he were going to lose to Democrat Bill Schultz. It was during this time when the Democrats started looking toward those who were more business oriented instead of labor focused, and Schultz fit the bill as he was heavily involved with real estate. Still, he would eventually lose to Goldwater by just 1.1%. This would be Goldwater's last political campaign. But as Goldwater was on his way out, a future heavyweight was on his way in. While Democrats did well in the 1982 congressional races, Arizona picked up yet another seat, with Republicans winning 3 out of the state's 5 seats. One person who wasn't returning to Congress was John Rhodes, who decided to retire from politics. Vietnam War hero and POW John McCain ran in Arizona's 1st congressional district, beating 3 Republican opponents in the primary and eventually winning the general election with 65.9% of the vote. But in the other big races, Democrats won with DeConcini and Babbitt dominating their races. While 1984 didn't see any big races, the Republicans picked up another seat in Congress. But it was 1986 that saw yet another dynamic shift in Arizona politics. It didn't take long for McCain to rise to the top, running for U.S. Senate and dominating Democrat Richard Kimball by 21%. As many of you know, McCain would serve in that seat until his death in 2018, never having serious competition. However, when it came to the governor's race, it was quite interesting. Bruce Babbitt decided not to run for re-election as he was getting ready to run for president in 1988. The Democratic candidate was Carolyn Warner, who was a moderate Democrat and Arizona Superintendent of Public Instruction. The Republican candidate was Evan Meacham, who we have mentioned before. Meacham came from the socially conservative right and campaigned on issues like abortion. He was challenged in the Republican primary by Burton Barr, a member of the Arizona House of Representatives who was backed by Ronald Reagan. Meacham would defeat Barr in what would be a major upset. But because many conservatives were skeptical of Meacham, there was a possibility that Warner could win with moderate Republicans voting for Warner in the general election. Bill Schultz, the guy who almost beat Barry Goldwater 6 years earlier, entered the race as an independent. For a while, he was considered a front-running candidate in a close race, as he was winning enough Democrats and anti-Meach Republicans to possibly win the election. But when all was said and done, Schultz mostly took away from Warner, leading to Meacham's surprise win. But almost immediately after winning his election, an effort started to recall him as governor. After collecting enough signatures, a recall election was called for May 17, 1988, with former Republican House Leader John Rhodes expected to run against Meacham. But the law would outpace the recall election, with Meacham being charged with 3 counts of perjury, 2 counts of fraud, and 1 count of failing to report a campaign contribution. The Arizona State House would impeach him, and the State Senate would convict him, removing him from office, making Secretary of State Rose Mofford the state's first female governor. Later, all charges against Meacham would be dropped. Yeah, Ted Stevens knows the feeling. That was in my last video. Mofford did not run for governor in 1990, which led to the Democratic nominee being Mayor of Phoenix, Terry Goddard. He took on Fife Symington, who was a real estate developer and member of the famous Symington family. During the election, Goddard talked about ethics in government, while Symington argued that he wasn't like Meacham. In the general election, Symington finished first with 49.7% of the vote to Goddard's 49.2%. But this was during a short period of time when Arizona required a runoff election if the winning candidate did not get 50%. In the runoff, Symington won by 4.7%. Interestingly, the state Senate flipped back to the Democrats, but 2 years later swung back to the Republicans. With the exception of a power-sharing agreement in 2001, the Republicans have held the state Senate ever since. 2 years later, John McCain would win re election to the US Senate, while George Bush only won the state by less than 2%. But the 1994 Republican wave made Arizona even more Republican. In 1992, the congressional delegation, now with one additional seat, was split 3-3. But in 1994, Republicans won 5 of the 6 seats, with Ed Pastor being the only surviving Democrat. One of those congressional seats was held by Sam Cooper-Smith, who decided to run for the U.S. Senate since Senator DeConcini announced that he was retiring from the Senate. However, he would lose to another congressman, John Kyle, by over 14%. And even though Bill Clinton won the state over Bob Dole in 1996, becoming the first Democrat since Harry Truman to win Arizona, the Republicans dominated throughout the 1990s, with Symington easily winning re-election in 1994. But in 1996, he was convicted of a number of fraud and extortion charges, leading to his resignation. Secretary of State Jane D. Hull then became governor, winning by 25.4% in 1998. John McCain was easily re-elected in 1998, with John Kyle winning re-election in 2000. The Democrats didn't even bother to field a candidate against John Kyle. Another influential Republican who was elected in 1992 was Joe Arpaio, the sheriff of Maricopa County. Until the early 1990s, immigration wasn't really considered a contentious issue as it was in neighboring California. But Arpaio changed that, rounding up hundreds of immigrants that he deemed were illegal. Of course, this was against the law, as it was federal law enforcement that was to enforce immigration issues, not local government. Irony, I know. Anyway, he would be highly influential in Arizona politics up until he left office in 2017. Not only did his office illegally target Hispanics for immigration violations, which were deemed illegal by the Supreme Court a number of times, oh, how times have changed, but he also caused this shift in Arizona politics, with Hispanic voters shifting over toward the Democrats more strongly than previously. One of the benefactors of this shift was Janet Napolitano, who ran for governor in 2002 and won by 1% over Congressman Matt Salmon. Interestingly, former Democratic Secretary of State Richard Mahoney ran as an independent and won nearly 7% of the vote. He presented himself as a reform candidate and appealed to those who didn't have strong partisan leanings. But his main political issues seemed to be focused on the prosecution of the fundamentalist LDS Church in Colorado City, led by Warren Jeffs, who 4 years later would be placed on the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. Mahoney argued that during her time as Attorney General, Napolitano didn't go after the fundamentalist LDS Church enough, and that Republican Matt Salmon, who was a member of the regular LDS Church, wouldn't go after Jeffs and his supporters because he was a Mormon. Even though the race was close and not truly decided until a few weeks later, Salmon congratulated Napolitano and did not challenge the results. In 2006, Napolitano easily won re-election with 63.6% of the vote, with Senator John Kyle winning by a little bit under 10%. However, Napolitano would only serve as governor until 2009, when she was appointed as President Obama's Director of the Department of Homeland Security. She was replaced by Republican Secretary of State Chan Brewer. While Brewer might not have been as brazen as Joe Arpaio when it came to immigration, she was probably more right-wing than any other governor at the time. During her time, she signed Senate Bill 1070 into law, which essentially legalized what Joe Arpaio was doing as Maricopa County Sheriff, allowing racial profiling and asking for immigration paperwork by state and local law enforcement. One person who strongly opposed the bill was State Representative Kirsten Sinema. More on her later. But as easily as Brewer won praise on the right, she lost it as well. While she opposed the Affordable Care Act, once it was passed, she said that she wouldn't sign any legislation into law until the legislature passed Medicaid expansion legislation. She would continue as governor until 2015, with Republican State Treasurer Doug Ducey easily winning in 2014 and again in 2018. Another person who benefited in 2006 was Democratic State Senator Gabby Giffords. Republican incumbent Jim Colby who was one of the most liberal Republicans in Congress and would later leave the Republican Party and endorse Joe Biden for president, retired from Congress, opening up his seat. While Giffords was a member of the Blue Dog Coalition, a group of moderate and conservative Democrats created in the 1990s, and the New Democrat Coalition, which is similar, she was quite liberal when it came to her voting record. In 2008, Giffords would win by nearly 10%, but in the 2010 Republican Tea Party year, Giffords' seat was one of the seats targeted by the Republicans. While the Republicans picked up 62 seats, Giffords' seat wasn't one of them, as she won by 1.5%. However, just 2 months after her re-election win, Giffords was shot outside a Safeway grocery store in Tucson, Arizona. Initial reports claimed that she had died. However, she would survive, but 6 others would lose their lives that day. After surgery and rehabilitation, Giffords made a miraculous comeback, and she, along with her husband, astronaut Mark Kelly, started an organization focused on preventing gun violence. In 2012, Senator Jon Kyl retired from the U.S. Senate and was replaced by Jeff Flake, a Republican congressman who only won by 3% over Democrat Richard Carmona, the former Surgeon General under President George W. Bush. The years between 2012 and 2018 were mostly dominated by Republicans. Yes, there were some prominent Democrats elected during this time, such as Kyrsten Sinema and Ruben Gallego, but these years were still dominated by Republicans. But a series of events would take place that would change Arizona politics into the purple state that we know today. First, let's start with the Senate seat held by John McCain. A little over a year after McCain cast the deciding vote to save the Affordable Care Act, which was actually a vote against the Republican alternative, he died on August 25, 2018. Therefore, a special election was to be held in 2020 to fill out the rest of the unexpired term. After McCain's death, Jon Kyl was appointed as senator, but said that he would only stay in the position for the rest of 2018. Luckily for Governor Ducey, Martha McSally had just lost her bid to win the U.S. Senate seat vacated by Jeff Flake, and thus was available to be placed in the U.S. Senate. McSally would run in the special election, easily winning the Republican primary. For the Democrats, astronaut and husband of Gabby Giffords, Mark Kelly, ran. Kelly would go on to win the election by less than 2%. In 2022, he would run for the full Senate term, taking on Blake Masters, who was basically just like Charlie Kirk. Anyway, Kelly won that election by nearly 5%. He was on the short list of possible vice presidential candidates for Kamala Harris, but that eventually went to Minnesota Governor Tim Walz. And in the other Senate seat, Jeff Flake decided to leave the U.S. Senate. As I already mentioned, Martha McSally lost and was eventually appointed to fill out John McCain's term. In the election, she was defeated by Democratic Congresswoman Kyrsten Sinema. Both candidates easily won their primaries, with Sinema winning by a little under 3% in the general election. While she did run as a moderate candidate, she was a former member of the Green Party. In her first years in the U.S. Senate, she voted like a typical Democrat. But around 2021, she, along with Senator Joe Manchin, started blocking Democratic legislation, most notably Joe Biden's Build Back Better plan. Eventually, she became hated in the party and would eventually register as an independent. In the end of her term, she seemed to be much cozier with lobbyists and basically ignored the needs of her constituents. She didn't run for re-election, but her seat was held by the Democrats, with Ruben Gallego defeating newscaster Carrie Lake by 2.4%. Gallego benefited from Hispanic voters who had voted for Trump for president and Gallego for Senate. This was the first time since Ernest McFarland that one Democratic senator followed another Democratic senator, if we want to consider Sinema a Democrat, since that's what she was elected as. And with that, we've come to the 2022 election for governor between Katie Hobbs and Carrie Lake. Lake seriously is probably one of the most interesting candidates that we've seen in a while. First, she was a Republican, then supported John Kerry and Barack Obama because she opposed George Bush, but then came back to the Republican Party. Now, as a Republican again, she mostly pushes conspiracy theories about COVID 19, immigration, and that the 2020 presidential election was stolen. Her Democratic opponent was Katie Hobbs, who basically didn't campaign. Yes, she attended some campaign events, but it was thought that the best way to defeat Lake was for Lake to destroy herself. Hobbs didn't even debate Lake during the campaign. But toward the end of the campaign, it seemed like this strategy could hurt Hobbs in the end. A number of polls started to show Lake in the lead, with Hobbs not far behind. But on election day, Hobbs won by 0.7%. Of course, Carrie Lake challenged these results but was unsuccessful, and to nobody's surprise, Lake claims that the election was stolen for a number of different reasons. And with that, we have completed the electoral history of Arizona. As I said in the past, though these videos are long, they're just brief looks at the electoral history of each state. I know that someone will say that I missed some esoteric thing from 40 years ago, but if I included everything, this would be a 20-hour video. Still, I hope that you learned something today and come out of the video knowing a little bit more about Arizona than you did before. If you want to join my Patreon, you can find the link in the description below. If you want to watch other state videos, you can do that by clicking the playlist on the left. If you want to watch something totally different, on the right is a video about John F. Kennedy's first campaign for Congress. Thank you for joining me today, and I will see you in the next video. Bye for now.